Excellent. Well, we're going to have to move over to our next presentation. Thank you very much, Wade. Just as a quick summary, clearly the study has a number of findings that need to be tested. And that is the natural course of research, building on research. So there are relationships that were established qualitatively, and they need to be tested clearly. Secondly, the use of terminology and the complexity of the conceptual model may have led to some confounding parts of the study, but we found upon validation, i.e. through the Delphi study, that there was confirmation. Again, that would provide the foundations for further testing. So again, congratulations, Wade, a very good study, and I think a contribution to futures research in terms of the predictive nature of strategic leadership theory. Thank you very much for those kind words. Okay, so we're going to hand over to Debbie now. Futures literacy in organizations is a new field, and Debbie has really moved this forward quite significantly. So we look forward to what you have to say, Debbie. Thank you.
And that last question was a great segue. But just to reiterate, I'm Debbie Schreiber, retired recently from my career in academia, but continue to work with UMass Global, advising dissertation students and doing my research. But that last question takes us to my topic. Lots of organizations manage through urgency, and that can become very stressful and tiring. And when I was teaching in organizational leadership, the way I got into futures thinking was there was very limited curriculum in the US that described future-oriented leadership per se within organizations. There's a ton of work on foresight, scenario building, and strategic planning and strategic foresight. There was a presentation this morning by Jay Gray that showed 50 years of research in that area, but it rarely got to transformational leadership or transformational organizational studies based on futures thinking. So with that, I want to start with where our challenges are. And the very last one there is results from a study done a couple years ago, where in the US, we have barely 20% of our graduate programs providing students with future-oriented leadership. You'll get studies on strategic foresight. You'll get studies on scenario planning, but you rarely get study on how to transform the organization to a mindset that institutionalizes those efforts. And that's where our research comes in. Oh, sorry about that. One of the things I wanted to mention was that Wade's discussion on work engagement brings to mind for me a situation where most organizations, it's rare that most organizations have that much information on the variables affecting the change and disruption in their organization. And so from Wade's perspective, when he goes into work with an organization, Wade, you're starting, 80% of the way there in terms of beginning work with the organization. Of course, the last 20% is tough because implementing those scenarios and attaining and actualizing the success is what can be elusive. Our research and the research with my colleague, Zane Berge, who's not with me today, looked at how we get an organization to the point of actualizing those scenarios and institutionalizing the effort. And we have a framework, conceptual framework, that 15 case studies that are published in a book that I brought, which is online and available. And we're currently finishing up a volume 2, where we have another 11 case studies with a slightly different focus. But we have support from these case studies that describe how an organization can be successful transforming themselves to that point. First of all, we don't think of futures thinking as scenario building. We think of futures thinking as a systems approach, and there's several processes involved, 4 major or primary ones. I'd like to present that information. I'll then talk about what future literacy in organization looks like in terms of best practices. And then if we have time, and if we don't, you can take the handouts. Being a professor for 40 years, I don't go to a presentation without activities. So I brought 2 what would be considered self-assessment tools that you could use in your organization to do 2 things. First of all, in our book, we describe the capability maturity model for using using futures thinking. So that capability maturity model is built on Paulin's work from the I don't know when did he work, 72, 73, just on organizational capability. And I've worked with capability models all my career in various ways, starting with use of technology in organizations. I then developed and segued to development of a model for organizations and their capability to use futures thinking. So one of the tools and one of the first things that an organization needs is to be ready for it. And this, again, Wade mentioned that, you can have a lot of things in place, but if the organization doesn't have the mindset, isn't ready to embrace what needs to be done to sustain your effort and to institutionalize it, it will not succeed in the future. And so one of the tools is looking at organizational readiness. And then the other one is assessing what is called futures thinking orientation of the organization, futures orientation, OFO, organizational futures orientation. And it actually is a worksheet where you can analyze your own organization in terms of best practices of futures thinking. So with that, let me go to our conceptual framework. Or conceptual theory. Our theory is based on essentially 4 primary processes. First of all, you have to recognize and see a signal of change. Second of all, you go into this cycle of foresight activity and use of foresight methods. And there's a number of methodologies used. Scenario building is just one. Scenario building comes from wargaming back in the 40s, 1940s, 1930s. And it's the one most organizations are most familiar with. Of course, if you have foresight experts in the organization, they're going to be aware of many others, and we'll go over some of those briefly. The point is that recognizing the triggers only happens if you really understand what the signals are telling you, what the change is telling you. And our case studies and other research that I've worked on identified that there's 2 things that will tell you a lot of information about the change. You have to be clear about the observation, be very concrete about it, and you have to interpret it correctly. And there's 2 ways that happens. You look at the source of the change, and you look at the process in the organization that it's affecting. And we'll talk about that briefly in a minute. When you get to the cycle of using foresight methodologies, you recognize in those changes what disruptions are most critical, which are the red flags. Not every disruption is a problem. Some of it's noise. And you need to make sure you are conscious about your assessments of that and decision-making. Once you begin to use foresight methodologies to build scenarios or identify trends and patterns or look into the future with the Delphi study, you then have to plan an action. You take your most viable activities or scenarios that you think will work, and then you plan how to implement. This is the crux of the problem. I'm not sure if I read it in Wade's research or somewhere else, but less than as much as 80% of viable scenarios never get implemented in organizations. And it's for a number of reasons. The organization's not ready. They don't have processes or policies in place for accountability. And this is where there should be a fulcrum between that foresight stage and actualizing the future. That fulcrum is built on internal organizational policies. That's what our research is showing. And the talk about policies is a really tough concept, because when you say policy to most organizational folks or government folks, they think broad policy. They think policy. They don't think internal process and procedure. They think they think public health policy. They think, any number of government policies. But when we talk about organizational policy, we're talking about internal procedures and processes. And they have to be institutionalized at that stage, or you're not going to sustain whatever it is you're trying to implement. You might implement a great scenario once, and that'd be great. But a capability maturity model where an organization does it once is not very mature in terms of capability. So with that, let's look at signals of change. In the first set of case studies that we have in this book, which this book is based on, identified 3 primary sources at that time. This was in 1819. The book was published in 2019. And they were broad categories of technology, globalization, and workforce diversity. That sense has changed. We've now identified sources in a much different way. And it uses all of those sources, but in an integrated or in collaborative context. But the point is that you do want to identify what the source of the change is. And the reason this theory, this conceptual theory, got so much traction, it came out of my teaching originally. But the reason it got so much traction with experts in the field, with organizational leaders, is because most organizations don't take the time to be in the present. They don't think concretely. They're, organizational leaders at the executive level are all out there. That's why they're leading at the executive level. But you've got to manage your thinking so that you can be strategic in the way you analyze. So identifying that there is actually something called the source of the change is important to see. The second part to that signals of change stage in futures thinking is understanding what's the process in your organization that it's disrupting. Is it communicate? And we identified primarily three processes that were continually being identified by the case studies. One is communication. The other area was the social and political climate of the organization. And the other is budget, allocation of resources. Those are not in any priority there in the diagram. There's just 3 processes that were identified as clusters of activities that could be affected. So the first step is to pay attention to that. Just be conscious of it. That's where most of the consulting I've done, the executive leadership isn't conscious of these things. Some of their staff may be, especially if they have foresight expertise, but not generally at the top level. When looking at foresight methodologies, we define foresight as the ability, skill, or art, and/or art that describes, explains, explores, not predicts. I include predict up there because it's in the literature, but we don't look at foresight expertise as predicting the future per se. But it assesses the consequences for the decisions that you need to take in the present. The common methodologies used, the most common, and these again are not prioritized, but the most common is building scenarios, but it's often done in a very willy-nilly way. And that's why Wade's research on work engagement is so critical for that particular attribute. Most organizations do not have that much research that drives their assessment of change within a technology field. Of course, we all know AI. I mean, I've been studying AI since 1984, and robotics was the first to make its advancements, and now we're into chatbots. But the point is that there's so much out there around the change, so many variables, that it's hard to get through that cloud of information. So the foresight methodology you should use in an organization should be the one that gives you what you need. If you're looking for future trends, you use a Delphi study. You don't build scenarios around current observations. If you're looking for an analytical assessment, you would use road mapping. I mean, there's very specific strengths and weaknesses of foresight methodologies. And finally, actualizing future success is based on, we found that there are four characteristics, I guess. Some are processes, but the first is the organization has to be ready. And you can do some self-assessment on that for your organization, and also read more and understand your current organization's capability maturity model for future thinking. You need to have embedded experts. Not only do you need technical expertise in your organization, I don't mean technical from a technology, you need to have content experts. I should use the word content expert. You need content experts in your organization, but you also need embedded foresight experts. If you don't have an embedded foresight expert and you get a group together to brainstorm, you've lost half your battle, because we just recognize that there are multiple ways to use foresight methodologies and multiple methodologies, and you select the one that's going to get you where you need to go or provide you with the most insight. We found, and this won't surprise anybody because the research already had presented this, flattened organizations, concentric work structures are much more effective for futures thinking than vertical hierarchies are. And finally, the fulcrum, internal policies for implementation, accountability, and institutionalization of your effort. That's critical. And every single one of these 15 case studies in this first volume on futures thinking illustrates how organizational policy was used successfully, or what organizational policies were recognized were needed to move the organization to a successful future, sustaining a successful future. This takes us to best practices. We did recognize and were able to glean from the case studies as well as some other research that there are definitely recognizable characteristics in organizations that are successfully futures literate, who are successful in their futures thinking efforts and are literate in futures thinking. You'll see that we have observation and interpretation of signals. So some of the characteristics are aligned to that skill. Emerging roles for employees and managers. There's some recognizable characteristics there. Realignment of structure and function. It's not only important to have the function and have the structure, but they have to be aligned to strengthen and support one another. And finally, the whole issue of organizational policy. And these are internal processes and procedures. One of the things I recognized, and Wayne and I'm having trouble since my co-partner and lifelong work partner is Zane Berge. I'm talking with Wade earlier, and we were talking about the percent of viable scenarios that are successfully implemented and how an organization does that. A comment was made in the conversation about, well, you need a top leader who's, championing the effort. Let me tell you, you can have a champion at the top all you want, but if you don't have a mindset in that organization and the policies and processes and procedures that keep people accountable, it won't go anywhere. It may go forward once, but it won't continue. It won't sustain. So let's look at some of these. Under observation, interpretation of signals, you have to have content experts in your field. In your organization. And I know in my lifetime, my work lifetime, We've gone from organizations that housed all of their expertise to organizations that outsourced much of it. And I think the pendulum is swinging back, where organizations are trying to make some good decisions about who to keep in-house, who to build and grow, and what to build and grow in-house versus outsourcing. And decisions need to be made about that. You need to have visionary competence. Visionary competence is the ability not only to observe and analyze change and disruption. It's not only the ability to look for patterns and themes in the progress of activity, but you need to be able to contextualize it. You need to be able to recognize those patterns are existing within a certain context. And if you change that context, it might in fact change the pattern. When we look at employee roles and roles for the managers, new roles recognized in some organizations are actually the role of the foresight expert. And not only is foresight experts that role important for an organization, it's good to have multiple experts distributed around the organization, because one of the most critical things, and I've heard it multiple times just in the last 24 hours here at this school, is that how little collaborative and integrated activity is happening in the futures thinking world. What you're seeing is, and a lot of those dissertations that Jay Gray went through support that thought or that reflection, that most of what we're seeing is very isolated to, and you'll see engineering publishing on strategic thinking. You'll see psychology publishing on strategic thinking, but you don't see organizational leadership per se integrating these studies into an organizational literacy for futures thinking. One of the other things that we recognized in these case studies is that the middle manager is a great source of information and facilitation within an organization. And the flatter the organization, the more effective that middle manager is. So you need to recognize it from top to bottom. By the way, I'm not opposed to CEOs, and I really like executive leadership and executive managers because they come with a wealth of information and personality and emotional quotient to get the job done. So there's a role for each person in that organization, but one person cannot do everything, and that's most critical for futures thinking. Okay, with that, let me go to, by the way, this is the second activity that I brought. It helps an organization do some self-assessment about their orientation for futures thinking. And so what you would do, following a list of questions of a guide, is answer, fill in some characteristics from your own organization, and then circle those that might be strengths and circle those that might be weaknesses. And then you can start having a conversation with some of your colleagues within your organization. The point here is that I simply am starting to describe for this presentation a little bit more about what some of these characteristics mean. So when we talk, I said earlier, visionary competence is not only understanding the patterns and trends that you're seeing, but to understand them within specific contexts. One of the things about trend receivers, I didn't mention that concept earlier. Trend receivers are those individuals in an organization that have visionary competence. Now, I can't tell you how much literature I'm seeing on computer programming, especially with the application of AI, that organizations are allowed themselves being vendor driven. I love that phrase. I've used it for 30 years. Beware of letting yourself be vendor driven when you're making decisions, because I'm not opposed to data programming that, quote, has visionary competence. And in today's world, can that visionary competence actually detect contextual influences? Maybe. But nobody knows your organization better than those who are working in the organization. So please keep that in mind. Again, so those are a couple explanations. When we talked about middle managers, they're a great attribute for future proofing the organization. They're the ones that can catch a lot of being blind. Middle managers are great for helping an organization keep from being blindsided. So, okay, I think that takes us to a couple handouts if we had time. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I can take questions.
This clock is wrong.
This clock is wrong. Okay. Why don't I put out a number of copies? Please, if you're in the same organization, only take 1 copy, but you're each welcome to take one of each of those activities if you like. My presentation can be sent to you by me. I'm on LinkedIn, although I found out earlier today there's another Deborah Schreiber, but there are images, so just look for the one that looks like me.
All right.
And I can surely send the slides. And if you have any questions.
Thank you, Deborah. Let's thank Deborah for the great. Any questions? We've got 2 minutes, 3 minutes we can push. Any questions for Deborah? Yes.
I'm a research director, Jari Kaivia from Finland Futures Research Center, and thank you for a very important topic and discussion. And one thing what is central in this presentation was benchmarking the best practices. So I think that there is a serious situation to use the best practice evaluation methods, and one of them is, of course, far out. How you really identify the best methods by far out logic? Are you
far out in the future?
Thinking this issue, because it's a methodological selection model that you can really filter out the best foresight methods or tools in companies or corporations or in big organizational structures. How you select the best methods? This, of course, we can say that this is Popper's diamond is the best way to do it.
I think I got it.
Say that maybe we need more precise selection methods.
Absolutely.
To find best practice.
I think I got the gist of this. The comment is that when looking at best practices, first of all, how do we benchmark that? Which is a very good question. And you have to understand that this is a case-based book, and the conclusions are drawn from the cases that were presented. The theoretical framework had already been established, and we were looking to see if we could support it. So from that standpoint, we didn't start with a benchmark. At this point, everything that I talked about today is open to quantitative evaluation. I'd like to start aligning. I'd start liking to collect some data that aligns best practices with levels in the capability maturity model, for instance. Also, you mentioned futuring. That's another thing that's critical. What is a best practice today may not be the most important best practice for, well, I don't want to say tomorrow, but let's say 2030. Where's Wade? So maybe 2030. But the point is, the next book, and I'll finish with this comment, the next book has case chapters that deal with not these broad areas of technology, globalization, and workforce diversity, but the tumultuous change in social media and their impact, social media, significant shift in wealth, and government instability. So they're fascinating case studies, but already within a 3 to 4 year period, we're changing focus again. So thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Everybody join us in thanking Deborah. Thank you. And just the last thing that I really enjoyed from Deborah's is the need for embedded foresight specialists. I think this is possibly the most exciting evidence that has emerged out of this study. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us, and we'll see you around next time.